Good afternoon. Let's see, slides. Thank you. Um, so my talk is sort of about metaphors today. I find it actually curious that I'm giving a talk to a bunch of product leaders because I don't think of myself quite that way. In fact, I don't quite know what I am. I've had an interesting career, mostly living in Silicon Valley. I'm having worked for some big tech companies, but also doing a bunch of community work. And I also didn't realize that Molly was a controversial startup, but I'm glad that it was. As of February this year, I packed all my shit into a storage locker in Treasure Island outside of San Francisco and decided to become a digital nomad for the very first time. This is me no, just kidding. I wish, right? Wouldn't that be amazing? I'm working on it. Anyways, so I became a digital nomad because among other things, my rent went up 20%, and I was like, why am I still here when I'm a digital person? Like, I can kind of work from anywhere in the world. And I'd basically gone through Y Combinator. I was a co-founder of this company, but then I left, and I had a big breakup, and so like my life wasn't really, my life fell apart basically, and I was trying to figure out what I was doing next. And really kind of came to this crisis moment of like, well, who am I? What I want to do in the world? I've done some interesting things and been part of the tech world for a while. But when I got to Silicon Valley in 2004, like, it was great. It was fun. There were a lot of amateurs like me who didn't know anything and could kind of like show up and just contribute and do things. But I found more recently, after I exited my startup, that I didn't find Silicon Valley quite as much fun anymore. There was a lot of professionals, and I'm not very professional. And so I was like, how do I fit into this space? What am I supposed to be doing here? Now, this doesn't mean that I'm done with tech forever. As we heard, there's actually like quite a lot of stuff to still do in the world of tech. And so I don't feel like that mission is over yet. But we also find ourselves in this moment where we're trying to come to grips with the changes that we've actually brought to the world through the success of a lot of the products that we've built, specifically in the world of social technology. And I know that both my contributions to that world as well as my friends' contributions to that world kind of put us in this state of like, well, how much responsibility do we bear for this, and what do we do next, and what happens in the next 10 to 15 years? So anyways, here I am in this interesting transitional moment. I don't have a fixed address anymore, and I'm coming and giving you guys a talk, and hopefully some of the things that I've learned over the last 15 years will be somewhat useful in terms of thinking metaphorically about product development. So these are the three things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to go into each one in detail. Well, actually, not too much detail. I don't have that much time. But what's also interesting is that I've never given this talk before, and I've never really talked about product before. So this is also an experiment. I'm going to fail fast in front of you guys, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable for you as much as it is for me. I want to start by talking about a positive and negative space. I wrote a piece in 2015 called Seeking Genius in Negative Space. And this wasn't specifically seeking my genius. It was just sort of like looking for solutions where people hadn't quite figured things out yet. If you want to read this piece, there's a bit.ly link there, just seeking-genius. What this is kind of talking about, and I guess I should say also, like, when I grew up, I didn't really know what I wanted to be, but I did a lot of stuff with art. I did a lot of drawing. My grandmother's an artist, and I thought that I was actually going to go down that path, but instead I also loved computers. So I ended up becoming a designer, which was kind of like the merger of those two disciplines and interests. One of the things that you learn in drawing is about figure and essentially depth. So you have positive and negative space. When you're drawing sort of a positive thing. Like if you think about a chair, you're drawing the shapes, the outline of that object. But if you draw the negative space, you're actually drawing what isn't there, what you don't see. And so, for example, when you look at something like this, how many of you guys see a bunch of, oh, there's my mic. How many of you guys see a bunch of dots in this design? Right. So as it turns out, there are no dots. It's actually your eye is trying to fill in the blanks because it thinks there should be information where there actually isn't. And so the foreground is actually causing you to think differently or to experience things because you have a bunch of pattern matching going on in your mind that's filling in areas where there is actually nothing. This is another good example where essentially there are a set of, you guys can see the cube, right? Yes? Well, this too is actually sort of an illusion where there's a bunch of shapes that are being oriented in a certain way to make it look as though it's something that you perceive or are familiar with. But in fact, it's not that at all. this is something that we do all the time. We delude ourselves into thinking that there is something there based on pattern recognition, but in fact there isn't anything. And learning to master this awareness, this self-awareness of how we see and how we perceive both objects, in this case in two-dimensional representation, as well as in the world at large, in culture and society, is important in order to come to a place of mastery where you can create really interesting and compelling experiences based on things that other people are not able to see. And to sort of put this into a broader context, I want to talk about this idea of the grid of words, which was presented by Alan Watts, who was a Western philosopher. How many of you guys are familiar with Alan Watts? A few of you. Okay, the rest of you should go check him out. He's pretty interesting. What he talks about is essentially with this grid of words. I'm opening my water, by the way. Essentially, all known concepts, words, labels, fit into, lose my mic? Okay, test, great, yes, good, okay. All known concepts kind of fit into a grid like this, where essentially every dot represents a known concept. And this is essentially where we sort of understand the world or parse it through. Still not working? Good. See you guys, I'm failing in front of you. Okay. Wait. Oh, hand mic. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, great. So here I am back. Okay, anyway, so we have this grid. Now, what's interesting about this grid, right, if all words sort of fit into a grid that looks like this, what's more interesting is actually the interrelationships between all these things. Essentially the dark matter, the dark space. It's in those places and in those contexts where we can make the most, I think, impactful difference. The problem, though, is when you're looking at this, these are all the things that we already know and we're already able to talk to each other through. It's finding those opportunities where there hasn't been a label or a word or a concept that's been created. And the way in which we can do that is by looking at things that are adjacent or have some relationship to the space that we're trying to fill, to create something new. Now, the example that I want to give for this is something that I helped create, which is Google Developers. So when I was at Google, this was in the 2010 to 2013 period, Google sort of assumed that anybody that built products that were on the internet was already a Google developer, that these people didn't actually need a place or a home base to organize themselves, to find each other. And so essentially they brought all sorts of different open source projects together into one homepage on a website called Google Code. And the problem was that it was very hard to actually tell what was a Google project from what was just a regular open source project. Beyond that, so I'll show you what a project looked like. This is Google Chrome from 2010. So this is an open source project, but it was run by Google, but it was sort of intermixed amongst everything else. You can see what design looked like back then in the web. The other problem for this type of website was that essentially it took a Yahoo-style directory approach to all of the products. So of the various things that Google was working on for developers, it had this enormous list and expected users to be able to understand what was available and to search these things for themselves. Now, in contrast, and of course this is the world that I had come in from when I joined Google, there was a lot of things that were happening both on the social web, but also with regards to social software development. So at the time, before Microsoft had acquired GitHub, developers were starting to share a lot of their work through this type of feed-based system. And Google had nothing like this. They had like maybe, well anyway, so Google had nothing like this. In addition, Stack Overflow was a place where developers were starting to build their reputation. They were sharing knowledge that they knew, they were sharing information that they had, and building up their own credibility with other developers. Again, Google had nothing like this. And at the same time, because I was also working on the Google Plus launch, Google didn't have a developer experience that was led by designers, but led by product people. They sort of assumed that engineers could design for engineers, which is sometimes true. But we were starting to realize that product was that differentiator. That design was going to be the thing that led to the success of social products. And so we needed a home for developers that actually started to look modern, that looked good, especially in the context of what Facebook was doing with their developer site, and Twitter as well. I mean, obviously these things have come a long way and the world has changed since then. But all the same, we ended up endeavoring down this path to say, well, look, what are we missing? What are we not seeing? Well, let's look around us. Let's look at the other developer experiences and figure out where there's a gap in the market for us, and let's fill it with a new site. And so essentially we went from Google Code to launching Google Developers at Google I/O in 2013. Now this is important also. There was a desire at the time to just call it developer.google.com. And for me, this was actually something that, having been embedded in the community, having watched what was going on, I knew that it was important for this to be a place for people to come together and to meet each other. And so that's where we came up with the idea for making it about developers as opposed to just a developer portal. And in fact, this site is still live today, and this is what Google runs a lot of their developer programs through. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about, so that was sort of negative space, learning to see things a little bit differently, is the contrast between pucks and stones. And I was thinking about this, and in a lot of like business texts, people talk about one of Wayne Gretzky's quotes, which is to skate where the puck is going as opposed to where it's been. Now, this is fine. This is sort of like a conventional business adage. The problem, though, is that if you're skating to where the puck is going to go, this is actually what everyone else is doing as well. And from a strategic perspective, that's not exactly a great place to be. You want to be doing something that's a little bit more perhaps subtle, a little more differentiated. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with this other sport called curling. How many people know what curling is? How many of you are Canadian? That's a remarkably small overlap. Okay, for those of you who don't know what curling is, I want you guys to like sort of embed this idea in your product design strategy, because once I discovered what curling was, it just blew my mind. So this is basically what it looks like. Ready? Wait for you guys to read that quote. Anyways, okay. So check this out. Anyways, that's the stone right there. Look at that determination, though, huh? I wish I had that much focus. All right, check it out. So these guys are sweeping, right? Sweeping the ice in front of this stone very rapidly, very quickly, as though they lose their breath in order to move the other stone out of anyways, that's what they do. It's an Olympic sport, apparently. So this is sort of in contrast. I don't actually know what my next slide is. What's my next slide? Oh, right. Okay, right. So this idea of curling as opposed to sort of playing hockey. By the way, again, like I don't really play sports, so this is sports ball as far as I'm concerned. But the idea that on the one hand you want to skate to where the puck is going, it's like, yeah, duh, of course, you want to predict the future, right, as we were saying, but that's really, really hard to do. So instead, what I have found is to sort of find an existing community or a set of people who are doing something that seems like it might be very similar. They're imitating each other, or they're learning or observing from each other, or they're experiencing the same set of pains. And if you come together and you embed yourself in that community, and then you kind of give the thing that you see happening a label, you might be able to organize people around it. And so this is what happened with co-working that was 2006. So in 2006, I was living in San Francisco. I'd been there for a couple years, and a lot of us were working out of cafes, like as a lot of us do now. The problem was that there wasn't really available Wi-Fi. There weren't really power outlets. You couldn't pee because someone would steal your laptop. It was stuff like that. It's like a real problem. Like talk about like customer concerns, right? And so a friend of mine named Brad Newberg had decided to essentially organize these bi-weekly get-togethers in a place. Actually, this was one of the first co-working meetups where he would bring people together and they would just kind of keep each other socially accountable for the work that they were doing. It was very informal, and all it was sort of a gathering of people week on week. And I independently had started doing the same thing, but again out of cafes, and very quickly recognized that there was a problem with doing that based on what I just said. And so we decided to start getting together on a regular basis to talk about what it would mean to have a dedicated space or spaces for us to come together, to work together, that were safe, that were comfortable, where you could have some social interaction. And especially given like the push to send people to work from home, this was an opportunity to get people to come back together again and to regain that social connectivity that they'd lost from working remotely and in isolation. So several of us started the first co-working space in San Francisco. It was called Citizen Space. And actually the first one was called Hat Factory. We ran that into the ground after 3 months because we forgot to charge people. But then we iterated on our business model, decided to charge people, and started Citizen Space. And as you can say, it was a nicer place to work, which it's true, it was. One of the great things that we offered then, which was a real big difference or differentiator, was internet access. I actually found this sign on the side of a road. I still have it, it's amazing. And we ended up essentially open sourcing not only like our business model, but our community model. We took what we saw was an existing behavior, made it available to people. We published all of our finances, all the money we were losing, all the money that we were making, because our intention and our desire was to create this global community of people who were serving themselves by creating these spaces and creating community to connect basically people of the internet or digital nomads. So now I find myself, interestingly, 14 years later, with the ability to go almost anywhere in the world and to work out of these spaces with people that I never met because of an idea that I put out there in the world so many years ago. And if you just look at sort of like the rise of co-working since we started it, there's now over 20,000 spaces that exist in the world, and there's probably even more than that. And the community that's been created, I think, as a result of that has been enormous. And what's even more interesting for me is that I left sort of working on that after I went to Google in 2010, and the community had enough momentum inside of it to just keep going and building. So from that perspective, if you're a product designer, it's interesting to think about that kind of success without even having to do any more work once you sort of set the ball rolling. So the last thing that I want to talk about, which I'm still sort of like working on exactly like how this makes sense, so maybe you guys can like give me some feedback afterwards, is comparing cooking and bartending. How many of you guys bartend? Wow, really? Because it's drinking's fun, right? So you should like figure out how to drink better. Well, anyways. Cooking, when I think about cooking, which I started to do because I started to get like sun baskets and like, meal prep things. You guys do that? No, you guys, this is New York, so I guess you guys just go out all the time, right? Well, now that I'm traveling, I actually like need to know how to cook, so I've picked it up a little bit. And what I find is interesting, about the process of cooking is that essentially like if you're trying to like make a meal like pad thai, there's like a pretty clear way of doing it. And you do it over and over again, and there's sort of, maybe a little bit of like variation, but for the most part, it comes down to following a series of steps, and usually, adding heat, and then something comes out the other end. And you do that sort of over and over again, and when you go to a restaurant and they don't prepare it the right way, you're kind of upset about it. But in contrast, I find that, I find that cocktails are a little bit more forgiving, and also a little bit more generative. In other words, you can take a bunch of raw materials, mix them together in different ways, and you can come up with entirely new, fascinating, and interesting solutions just based on sort of mastery of a set of basic ingredients. So this is essentially the very straightforward recipe for making any cocktail. If you guys don't know this, like whenever you go someplace, you can just ask for like a base spirit, usually it's 2 ounces. You can add in a sour ingredient or a citrus, usually maybe like 1 ounce, and you can add something that's sweet, like a vermouth, and then I wouldn't add vermouth to a citrus, but anyways, like, you get the idea. You put these things together in different formulations or different proportions, and you've got yourself a cocktail. And one of the things that's, I think, interesting from a product design perspective, if every cocktail is a product that's being designed for a customer, someone who's a bartender, and this is a shot from Lisbon, where I was a couple months ago, you have this enormous range and array of different ingredients that have slightly different aspects to them that you want to figure out how to mix and match to create new experiences. And so if you are a master bartender, you've tried all these things. You have a good sense for what they're all good, good for slightly, how they compare and contrast, and usually a story about where these things came from. And I know, having done some UX and UI design, that you need to know all the form elements. You need to know all sorts of different like auto-suggest, auto-complete tools to mix and match stuff to create new and novel solutions. One of the ways in which bartending became kind of relevant to me, this is actually me in Tahoe. One of the things that I did when I was at Google was I realized that Google was made up of a bunch of engineers who weren't so social. And so the way to solve that problem of getting Google engineers to be more social was to get them to drink. And so I created the Plus Mixology program, where essentially I had Uncle Larry buy me a bunch of booze so I could teach schoolers how to like mix drinks. And so this was essentially me tending bar. And this is my hashtag bar, which I had before I left San Francisco. And I had a good sense for all these different ingredients, how they work together, and I would essentially try to just mix and match, put things together, and come up with new stuff. From a product design perspective, I guess like when I think about this, you can create very finite solutions from a set of known quantities and deliver something new to the market. And so when it comes to me thinking about this and applying it to the work that we do, I was asking myself a question like, is there a recipe for social software? And I would say now, maybe there is. You can download a bunch of open source software that will get you up and running very quickly. We'll solve a bunch of problems. Usually there's forums, there's profiles. You see a bunch of, I don't know, I see a bunch of apps that come out that have a lot of the basic stuff and are just focused on different communities or different content. But back in 2007, there really wasn't. We were just getting started, especially because the iPhone had only come out in June of 2007. And so it was like, well, how do we do this? Well, let's sort of like mix and match a bunch of things that already exist in the marketplace to come up with a solution for what at the time was a new social network, a new social platform called Twitter. And the problem that I was trying to solve at the time was to figure out how to get people to have unified conversations given the available technology. And this is essentially how that happened. So a lot of, and I guess when I think about the solutions that people were offering to the problem of how to have more topical conversations on Twitter, they looked at existing recipes. And they were like, okay, well, we know how to cook forums. We know how to cook groups. So why don't we just take what Flickr, which is sort of like the Instagram of the day, was doing, and we'll just build all these features into Twitter. Now, I knew that Twitter was going to be one of the first mobile social networks, and that offering all this kind of administrivia made no sense. And so essentially what I said was, well, look, the iPhone has just come out, but most of us still have devices that look like this. Do you guys know what this is? This is a cell phone, right? Okay, and on this cell phone, which for some reason has German on it, essentially the way that you would text people was through this numeric keypad. And so there are these two keys that were on this, that were on the phone that weren't really being used for anything. There was the asterisk and there was the pound symbol. So it was like, aha, what I'm trying to do is get people to essentially make their content more usable by more people. Well, maybe I can use what's already in the marketplace. So this is one ingredient. That might be the base spirit, if you will. Second, Twitter at the time had a feature called Track. Now, I don't know, how many of you guys were on Twitter in 2007? A few of you. So you might remember that when you followed someone on Twitter, you were basically signing up to get SMSs for every single tweet that everybody that you followed would send out. Does that make sense? So just imagine that. Imagine like subscribing to Trump and getting an SMS every time he tweets. Not only would you lose your sanity, but you wouldn't be able to follow anybody else. But one of the features that Twitter had at the time was the ability to track certain keywords. And so if you tracked a keyword, you get an SMS every time someone mentioned that word. Now this is in the early days, so there weren't that many tweets. But one of the problems was you could do something like track iPhone, and now you get all the tweets about the iPhone, but you couldn't use two words in this feature. So you couldn't do tracks open space source. Now this problem had sort of been solved on Flickr. Again, I showed you this before, with the concept of a folksonomy, which essentially is a way of labeling content using user-generated tags. So you can see that, and this is, I think, in June of 2005, people were essentially concatenating or putting together strings of words together to label something. And people would figure out what was trending, and they would use that. I then thought, well, Twitter's a real-time service. Well, what else is real-time right now? This is something called IRC. How many of you guys know what IRC is? I feel like this is like a history lesson. Okay, this is basically what Slack was built on. What's amazing is this is like an open protocol that existed back then, and now Slack is what, $2 billion? Just find stuff lying around in the grid of words, and you can probably make a bunch of money. So they had this idea of channels, and at least in the early days of IRC, a channel was had a prefix of a pound symbol. I was like, okay, well that's interesting. And if you started to put this whole list of cocktail ingredients together, and you shook it together, you ended up with essentially the hashtag, which essentially was sort of a customized, perfect drink that took 12 years to kind of mature in a barrel to get to the right flavor that it is today. And now, there are at least maybe last year, over 200 million hashtags that are used per day on Twitter alone. So that doesn't count Instagram, that doesn't count anyplace else. I actually heard a stat last night that 80% of all social media posts have hashtags in them. So again, from this very simple solution, where I was looking to solve a problem, sort of a negative space problem in the grid of words, to thinking about behavior and embedding myself in that platform and system, to sort of doing the curling thing where I was sort of the sweeper in front of the ice, kind of making space for this thing to go down, to finally now, I guess, let's see. Right, so sorry for that transition, that was really awkward. Anyways, so I'll start that over again. So essentially, as I was trying to sort of solve this problem that existed, where we're like, okay, how do we apply these ideas to, nope, this part isn't working. I'm just gonna go through this. Okay, great. cooking and bartending. That was the last part. So essentially, rather than just taking an existing recipe for social software, which was like groups and stuff like that, with a hashtag, it was actually mixing a drink that was made just for that time. So the reason why this talk is like a little bit strange, which is perfectly strange, is because, as I said in the beginning, I'm sort of going through this transitional moment where I'm trying to figure out where we go next with both product design, with technology, our individual relationship to technology, to each other, to how we're building software to support humanity, and what that looks like for the next 15 years. Because the things that I contributed to and that my friends contributed to now, of course, are affecting culture in a major way. And so I'm sort of having to leave Silicon Valley to get out of the set of words that are familiar and known to all these people to try to find new answers and new solutions. And so I find myself kind of in this sort of strange metaphorical position where I don't quite know what I'm doing, but now that I'm able to look back and sort of see some of the things that I did and make some sense of them and contribute to that grid of words, the positive space, hopefully that'll help you guys think differently about the way that you approach product as well. And if you want to follow along as I'm sort of like figuring out the rest of this, there's a hashtag, of course, for my journey. It's Messina Odyssey. And that's what I've got for you today. So thank you. Wait, yep, okay, I've just been told that I can take questions. So don't ask me if this doesn't make any sense, but yes, sure.
Based from all the drinks you've made, do you think there's a potential cocktail solution that you could potentially use for that? And what do you think is next for like social software in general in the next few years?
You can repeat it or I can repeat it. What do you prefer?
All right, I'll repeat that.
Go for it.
So how do you bring out people from their social bubble? Based on all the drinks you've been making over the last few years, do you think there's a cocktail solution that could potentially solve that? And at least open up people to different ways of like different ideas? And do you think, based on what you've experienced, do you think what is next for social software for you, at least?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is like a super fascinating question. I think on the first point, how do you sort of break people out of their, I don't know if you're talking about like echo chambers or just sort of like getting people to open up socially. I think what I found is to like distract people, which is why I did like the mixology program. So essentially, one, you had two benefits of this. First, you gave people something to learn where everyone was sort of like equally ignorant and they all had a motivation, which was to learn to drink better. Like when I started drinking, I didn't know that like there were different gins. I thought it was all like, you know, motor engine fuel or something where like it all just like had a different brand, but it was all the same. Just put it in the car, which was my body, and like it would sort of make it go. But it turned out actually there's quite a lot of variety. And so you're trying to like teach people something that a lot of people don't know and getting them to have a conversation about it. So you're facilitating interaction. And one of the things that we were doing with co-working was to accelerate serendipity by causing people to have these moments of openness and vulnerability and introspection. Not in a forced way, not in a way where like everyone's doing trust falls, but in a way where you're focused on something else. And so you're sort of like standing side by side to someone else. So I guess facilitating those types of interactions from a behavior design perspective. Your second question about the future of social, I think, is also very interesting and one that I've been thinking a lot about because I've done a lot of both, I guess, observing and thinking about conversational software. And so in the grand arc, I think this is sort of like the way when I think about like curling, in the grand arc of technology, software and technology is getting easier and easier to use by more and more people. You know, this is the first year where more than 50% of the planet is connected to the internet. And of course, there's a question of what are these people doing and what is their computing experience going to be like? And if you then ask the question, okay, in the next 10 years, when we connect the last 50% of humanity to the internet, what are their computing experiences going to be like? What are they going to expect? If they haven't grown up on the laptops, the desktops, the phones that we do, what are they going to experience? And to me, I think a lot of that comes down to voice computing. Voice computing is very natural, it's very easy. It allows people to have a conversation with their computing devices, and it means that you don't even have to be literate. You can literally be like 2 or 3 and have a conversation with Alexa, which of course raises questions for parenting and so on. So when I think about living in a world where we're having actual relationships with artificial intelligences and social agents, or social agents that represent us, you know, in the world, I'm looking at that, and I'm trying to think about how we can actually change the people who are building those products to perhaps embed more empathy, more understanding, more consideration, and perhaps more mindfulness into those technologies. Because when I think back to, you know, my friends who created Facebook and Twitter, and Instagram, we sort of assumed that the people who were using our products would probably be a lot like us. There was a lot of doubt and skepticism about social media. But now that actually those things have become very successful, I have a very different way of thinking about the responsibility that we as product designers have to create products that actually enrich humanity and create more relationships between people and more understanding, as opposed to just try to suck away their attention. So it's a very long-winded way to say that's kind of what I'm thinking about and where I think this might go next. All right, well, thank you so much.